Hi there, my name is Holzer, and I chair the board of the Citizens Transportation Coalition, which is an all-volunteer grassroots advocacy group. And our mission is to get neighborhoods involved in transportation planning. The idea is that big projects like interstates and toll roads and train routes and freight rail and all of that, these big projects affect quality of life in our neighborhoods, and therefore neighborhood people should be involved in planning them. I'm going to talk today about the US 290 package of proposed expansions. For those of you who aren't super familiar with Houston geography, 610 is here, you're down here in Greenway Plaza, and US 290 extends northwest through northwest Harris County out towards Waller. And the projects we're going to talk about today are all along this 38-mile corridor. So this is a vast distance we're covering. The existing corridor is actually really interesting. It's got a whole bunch of different critical transportation assets in it. Part of it is US 290 and the main lanes and the frontage roads that we think of when we think of 290. But in addition, there's a reversible HOV lane for carpools and van pools and motorcycles and commuter buses in the middle of 290. There's also Hempstead Highway, which runs a parallel, kind of wiggles next to it for much of the route. And also Union Pacific has a freight rail line, or they call it the Eureka Subdivision, that runs parallel to this corridor as well. So the project we're going to talk about has impacts for all of that. Back in 1999 or so, TxDOT started a major investment study. They started first looking at, gosh, there's a congested corridor here. What can we do to plan ahead and expand capacity and improve mobility in this corridor? And that process, because they're seeking federal funds to do it, requires creating an environmental impact statement. And so over the last decade or so, there's been a whole bunch of documentation and research and analysis that has culminated in what's called a final environmental impact statement that looks like that. It's thousands of pages of documentation, and it includes what's proposed in the project. So it's got schematics and maps and data analysis and all kinds of crazy stuff. And that was released for public comment last month in mid-April. And under the federal process, they're required to give the public 30 days to comment on it. So, as David mentioned, we're an all-volunteer group. CTC volunteers in conjunction with Houston Tomorrow folks and Sierra Club folks and White Oak Bayou Association folks and a whole bunch of people, homeowners, all kinds of folks, spent most of 30 days feverishly pouring through these documents and trying to understand what's proposed and how it fits in with neighborhoods and what are the impacts and what's done right and what's missing and so on. So the work I'm going to talk about here is talented amateurs. You know, none of us, no, that's not true. There are a couple of traffic engineers involved. But anyway, mostly we'll say talented amateurs. In terms of what comes next, that deadline for comment has passed. TxDOT is seeking a record of decision, which is basically the formal conclusion of the federal process, the decision-making process, whether to authorize them to go forward and spend federal money on this project. We would argue that there are critical issues that remain unresolved in this planning process, and that it would be better for TxDOT to craft a supplemental FEIS to address some of those issues, in particular related to noise abatement, in relation to timing of some pieces of the project, in terms of how we're going to continue to have great transit service in the corridor. And that's what we're suggesting they do. And we've urged Federal Highway to require TxDOT to go back and do this supplemental work to get those issues addressed before they move forward. Part of why we're encouraging that is that under Safety Loop, which is the federal transportation bill from 2005, anybody have a year? Does that sound about right? The last authorization?
Oh, yeah.
Something like that. Well, anyway, it used to be that if there were a federal planning process and homeowners were affected or business owners were affected, they had lots of time afterwards to come back and seek remedies or get recourse. But under Safety Loop, there's a new statute of limitations that basically says from when Federal Highway issues this record of decision, if you've got a problem with the project, you've got 180 days to get it addressed. That's not a lot of time. So our argument is that creating a supplemental FEIS to address those issues will have more equity and more opportunity for all of the people in this corridor to get their issues addressed before it moves forward. So of stuff today. I'm going to talk about neighborhood impacts. I'm going to talk about transit impacts. And then the last thing is I want to talk about development impacts. So let's start with neighborhood. Anybody here, has everybody seen a schematic before? Anybody? Anybody not seen a schematic before? All right. So here's a schematic. This is the 290 interchange with 610. So from that big view, we are now drilled way into this intersection. This is the Lazy Brook neighborhood over here. Here's the Brook Hollow complex. The 290 is going northwest out that way. Now, as part of this process, TxDOT is redesigning the interchange to add more capacity and relieve the bottlenecks there, and that's a good thing. And also as part of that process, they are closing and relocating some on and off ramps to create more distance between places where people get on and off the main lanes of the freeway. And that's a good thing because it's going to reduce traffic conflicts and hopefully bring the crash rate down at the interchange. In terms of the neighborhood, however, there's concern that moving those ramps will affect local access and also affect local traffic congestion. So it used to be you could get on here, but now if you're trying to get on the 290, you're going to have to get on actually east of TC Jester. This is TC Jester back here. And so neighborhoods, particularly the Brookwood Estate folks and the Lazy Brook folks, are concerned that A, it's a little bit more difficult for them to get where they're going, but more to the point, that other people who are trying to get out on 290 are going to end up driving through their neighborhood up here or back here to get to those ramps. The FEIS doesn't really talk about that impact. And we would argue that the FEIS should think about that, and perhaps TxDOT should partner with City of Houston to make sure that if there's work that can be done on the ground to make sure that that additional traffic doesn't unduly impact the neighborhood, now would be the time to figure that out. So that's an example of a neighborhood impact. Another impact has to do with noise from ramps. This is not 290, this is actually 610. This is North Post Oak here, north of Memorial, looking towards the new 610 ramps behind me. And these ramps are at about the 50-foot range. As part of improving the 290 interchange with 610, there are going to be new ramps, some of which are going to top 100 feet above grade. So like a 10-story building, that's pretty tall. That's great in terms of traffic, except it has impacts for noise. And some of the issues with noise have to do, the steeper a grade is, the more engine noise there is. And the higher a ramp gets, if I'm a diesel truck going up a ramp 100 feet in the air, the noise from that travel extends much deeper into the adjacent neighborhood than it would if that ramp were down at grade or just 20 or 30 feet up. So, first of all, the neighborhood, this is Lazy Brook again, right next to the interchanges, particularly at 610 and also at Beltway 8, are going to have new sources of roadway noise that impact their neighborhoods. So far, the FEIS is meant to assess that impact and budget for mitigation, that there's some issues with the noise analysis in the FEIS. One has to do with who they have counted in terms of where are the noise receivers that they should be thinking about. There are places where they've only counted the people immediately on the boundary of the highway right-of-way. But if you've been within a block of a highway, you know that the noise doesn't stop at the first row of property owners, that noise can actually cascade into the neighborhood quite deep. There are other places where they haven't even counted all of the noise receivers right at the freeway edge. So they haven't counted all of the people who might be affected in terms of noise. Now the reason that matters is that the process for deciding how much money you get to spend on noise mitigation is driven by how many people are going to be affected by the noise and how much benefit they can get from the mitigation. So in our estimation, there are legal sufficiency issues with how this process has been done, and there are actually substantive calculation errors in how the noise analysis has been done. So this is a piece of what we're pushing TxDOT to go back and to redo or re-look at in a supplemental FEIS for the project. Now that has to do with the analysis. The other thing has to do with the mitigation they're proposing. So when you look at what kind of relief TxDOT is planning for all of the homeowners along this 38-mile project from noise, they've basically proposed what are called boundary walls. or sound walls, right on the ground at the edge of the highway right-of-way. So this is an example, not from 290, but from I-10. This is I-10 at Voss. And you can see boundary walls. They're kind of a Mark I Mod A standard basic sound wall, if you will. Now, those can work well if you're a house and you are affected by the noise and you are right next to the highway. They can put a wall there. It's limited if what you're next to is a freeway ramp, because if your wall is here and your ramp is there, clearly the noise is going to come over the ramp. That's the first problem. But the second problem is when you look at where TxDOT is proposing these noise mitigation walls for 290, there are only 6 locations along this entire 38-mile corridor that have been deemed feasible to get ramps. And part of why is that many of the other locations have commercial development right along the frontage road. And the idea is that you can't, well, you could, but that it might not be desirable to put a noise wall, an opaque noise wall between the frontage road and the commercial business. The commercial property owners aren't really excited about that. Okay? One of the things that TxDOT has done to deal with that in other locations, again here along I-10, is that they've actually put walls behind commercial property. Now I cannot say that this is a TxDOT wall here. This is behind IKEA on I-10 at Silver. But there are places along I-10 where TxDOT, even though they didn't have right-of-way behind a commercial property, actually worked with property owners to build noise walls behind the commercial property, between them and the residences behind, to help mitigate that freeway noise for adjacent neighborhoods. That's not really very complicated. That's a fairly, a little bit creative perhaps, but that's a really easy solution. And they have not proposed any of that along 290. The other thing that can be done and is done in other parts of both this country and the world is to use on-structure barriers. So have any of you driven 610 through Bel Air? Anybody? Have you noticed in 610 that there are actually noise walls right on the freeway structure? That the side rails are higher, right? And that's because the city of Bel Air worked with TxDOT to ensure that mitigation would be on the freeway structure instead of off on the ground out at the edge of the right-of-way. TxDOT has not considered that. They basically ruled that out for this project, and we argue that that's not appropriate, that there are sufficient numbers of people impacted who could benefit from those measures to warrant including that in 290, but they haven't. So that's the noise issue. The next thing I want to talk about is transit. I said at the beginning that the 290 corridor, in addition to the main lanes, also has a reversible HOV lane going up the middle. And here's a picture of what parts of that look like. This is Brook Hollow, pretty close to the 290-610 interchange, and there's an HOV lane that goes out and it runs down the middle of 290. And while there are folks who aren't real excited about HOV lanes, this was a huge project, and this is our commuter transit service in Houston. For all that people are all excited about commuter rail, in Houston, Metro and other transit providers actually serve commuters with park and ride buses. And across the city, they serve, with buses, more than 40,000 people a day on a 100-mile system of HOV lanes. And when you include carpools, it's more than 100,000 people a day who use these HOV lanes. So this is a really important piece of how we maximize travel on our freeways during rush hour. Along 290, there are currently, 5 park and ride lots. This is the Northwest Transit Center down here at 610, and then Pinemont, Little York, Northwest Station, and Cypress Station. The 4 innermost of these lots are actually connected directly. They have direct connector ramps to the HOV lanes. And what that looks like is this. This is West Little York. So here's 290, the main lane. And this is the HOV lane in the middle of the freeway. And it has a direct ramp for both buses and carpools straight into the West Little York park and ride lot. And the advantage of that is that if you're a carpool or a van pool or a bus, that you can get directly into the HOV lane without ever sitting in traffic, without being part of the gridlock, without ever hitting a traffic signal. They've got direct access. And that's part of how TxDOT and Metro worked to ensure reliable trip times for transit users in the HOV lane. Coming back to this map, the one exception to that is the new station out at Cypress at Skinner Road. that right now is actually beyond the end of the HOV lanes. So when the HOV lanes were constructed, they didn't go out that far. Okay, so the opportunity here is how do we make sure that whatever expansion we do in the 290 corridor, that we don't leave these people worse off than they are? Because right now this HOV lane carries more than 20,000 people a day. If those folks were to all end up in the main lanes, that's going to have an impact on travel times for everybody. The congestion gets a lot worse. So figuring out how to continue to serve these 20,000 people is critical. Now when you look at the plan that's documented in the FEIS, TxDOT and Harris County are partnering on two separate pieces of this project. One piece is to add capacity to 290. The other piece is for the county to build shiny new managed lanes, like West Park, along Hempstead Highway, the Hempstead managed lanes. And the current proposal is that all of these transit and carpool people are going to leave 290 and they're actually going to be served on Hempstead instead. That Hempstead, the county will build managed lanes that
managed lanes, you mean toll?
I mean combined, not just toll lanes, but toll lanes that are free for transit users, free for 3+ carpools, etc. So the current proposal is that all of these users are going to go away from 290, that the HOV lane that's there right now will go away, and all of those people are going to be on Hempstead, which could work. There are issues with how you do it, though. So one thing is, are there direct connector ramps, like we've got on 290 today? And when you look at the plan, they actually have them for some of the lots. So Northwest Station gets a direct connector ramp, and Cypress Station gets a direct connector ramp, which is actually an improvement over what it's got today. West Little York, where the lot is situated directly between 290 and Hempstead, would not have a ramp. It would have a traffic signal, and people would go through traffic signals. So that's going to add some time to those trips, but maybe not a lot. But the current plan abandons the Pinemont lot altogether. And the second question is about timing. So if I am a casual reader of this document, of this 1,000 pages of document, I would come away with the impression that TxDOT and Harris County have worked together very closely, and that these managed lanes are going to get built first. In fact, I'll show you a map at the end that shows the phasing. This is quite clearly. We're going to fix the interchange, and then we're going to do the managed lanes so that we can get these guys service and have a relief valve for all the people on 290 before we mess up 290. The problem with that is that TxDOT has no ability to make that happen. In 2007, Senate Bill 792, which was the same bill that said Harris County gets the right of primacy to develop projects like the Grand Parkway, also gave them primacy to the Hempstead managed lanes. So the Hempstead project is a county project, and it only happens if Harris County Commissioner's Court decides to spend money and do it next. And the problem is when you look at what Harris County is doing with their money, all signs point to they're not doing it next. In 2008, Harris County Commissioners had allocated $2 billion, more than $2 billion, to getting the Hempstead managed lanes built. When you look at their capital improvement plan from 2009, so coming up on a year ago, they had cut their allocation for Hempstead in half to just about $1 billion, despite only an 11% decrease in the overall capital budget. They cut Hempstead in half. And when you talk to the commissioners and the folks over there right now, they don't sound really excited about Hempstead. They're like, oh, there are problems with the project. TxDOT needs to sort stuff out. They've kind of stepped back, said we're not doing it yet. That kind of leaves a whole bunch of people in the Northwest Harris County travel corridor hanging. And one of the things that we are arguing is that the county needs to get it together and figure out Hempstead now. And these improvements need to happen before we dismantle the HOV lane and before we start tearing up 290 and making more congestion with TxDOT over there. We need to get the Hempstead project sorted out. The next timely piece for that is Harris County's capital improvement project hearing is June 22nd. So if that's something that interests you, or if you know somebody in Northwest Harris County who might want to talk to their commissioners, the time to do that is the next month, between now and June 22nd. All right. Another opportunity has to do with future rail service. So, has anybody heard, ooh, we're excited about commuter rail? There are people in town who are, anybody heard any of that? Yeah, sure. I mean, everybody's like, oh, we're going to talk about commuter rail. Okay, great. Well, one of the places that is most likely ready to get commuter rail soon is this same 290 corridor, partly because there's lots of untapped demand out there for transit, and also because the freight line that Union Pacific operates takes about 6 trains a day at this point. And Union Pacific has said to Harris County, we could probably run those trains at night so that you could run commuter service during the day. That's kind of cool. The first problem with that, however, is when you look at this documentation, the FEI's project plan, there's no provision for the commuter rail. It's vaporware. It's not real. There's no money, there's no planning, there's nothing there except a set-aside. There's a right-of-way set-aside of 50 feet next to the Union Pacific rail line that says we can have transit out here. Somebody else should figure that out, not us. Okay, so that is not planned. CTC volunteers argue that if there were ever a time to put transit into this corridor, it's before we spend $2 billion on 290 and before we spend another $2 billion on the Hempstead Vantage Line. The time to put transit into this corridor is now, if we're going to do it. But there are no provisions for that right now. The second problem is if you want to operate commuter service or intercity service to Austin, or even high-speed rail service through this corridor up towards College Station or even Dallas, you've got to deal with grade separations. This is an aerial view of Hempstead Highway here, and this is West Little York, running east-west of 290's up here somewhere. And I was very excited to find a picture that happened to show a train blocking a crossing. Here's a freight train on the Union Pacific rail line, and a whole queue of cars. Right now, today, where the freight rail line and where the cross traffic meets have conflicts. It causes traffic. Every one of those crossings right now is at the same grade. There aren't overpasses and underpasses so that people can move at the same time. All of these crossings are at grade, which has implications for the quality of the travel for both the people in the vehicles who are crossing the freight line and also for any of the trains on the freight line. So one of the things we'd like to see is let's address this. What the county has designed and told TxDOT to include in the FEIS looks a lot like West Park. This is a view of West Park. This is not Hempstead. This is a current view of what's built on West Park, where there are at-grade lanes for West Park as a road, and then the West Park toll road is next to it. On Hempstead, it's likely to actually be in the middle rather than side by side. But then when they get to a cross street, the toll lanes go up and over, right? You can't have toll lanes stopping at traffic lights, so let's take them up and over. This is great if you're on the toll road. But if you're either on West Park or on the cross streets, you've got exactly the same traffic problem you have here, just with the toll road going over you. We haven't solved anything with this situation. So the opportunity is to perhaps do something more like we did on Hardy. So again, it's the county, different project, different location, different right-of-way availability. But on the county, on Hardy, here's the Union Pacific rail line. Here they built the toll lane next to it at the same grade as the rail. So the toll lanes are uninterrupted and the rail is uninterrupted. And then where they're major cross streets, they took them up and over both. Now, on Hardy, they had lots of room to do that. But we did a quick conceptual rendering. This is really rough of what that might look like on Hempstead. This is Hempstead Highway at Bingle. So here's Hempstead. And again, you could have Hempstead at grade and the existing UP subdivision. And then we can take cross streets up and over. Now again, this is really rough. It doesn't have turn lanes. It doesn't have everything here. But the idea is it seems possible to design the managed lanes and Hempstead and the Eureka subdivision and think about that as a whole set so that we could solve an existing problem for the next 100 years instead of just adding another level of complication to the existing situation. So that's transit. The third chunk I want to talk about is development and development impacts. I mentioned at the beginning that this set of projects is for a 38-mile corridor. The project logical termini are defined as from 610 in central Houston all the way out to FM 2920, essentially at Waller. It's a long, long corridor. And when you talk to people about should we do 290, what should we do with 290, they say we've got to do 290. And they talk about it like it's this one project and it's all or nothing and we should just do the whole thing. And I want to encourage you to think about this bucket of projects in chunks with some more nuance to it. If I look at an aerial view, this is Google Earth, so satellite imagery. Here's 610, here's I-10 going west, and here's 290 coming north out of northwest of Harris County towards Jersey Village. As you look at the satellite imagery, you can tell there's a ton of development, right? There's people, there's shops, there's schools, there's hospitals, there's all kinds of stuff going on here, right? This is the developed central Houston area. And when you look at census data, and you look at a 3-mile corridor around 290, you basically look like who's around 290. From here to Cypress, there are 384,000 people within 3 miles of the corridor. That's a whole bunch of people. And as a result, you've got traffic counts that are consistent with that. So if I look at TxDOT's 2008 traffic count data for this corridor, we've got upwards of 200,000 people a day traveling on US 290. So when people say, oh my God, 290 is congested, they're right. There are a ton of people using 290 every single day. When I get further out, the picture this is again Google Earth, but now I'm looking at the far northwestern extremes of this study area. So here's Waller and Hockley, and Satsuma's down in here somewhere, and Cypress is right about here. As you look at this imagery, it looks different, right? So instead of seeing a whole bunch of commercial and residential development, what I'm seeing is undeveloped rural land and agriculture, primarily. This is different. And when I look at the population data, again, for the same time period at that 3-mile corridor, there are less than 50,000 people in the corridor, compared to 384,000 further in. And the traffic counts reflect that. So this is, again, 2008, same time period. When I get out to the far ends of northwest Harris County, I get down under 50,000 vehicles a day. The travel demand, the existing travel demand in this corridor is very different at the northwestern extremes of the study area. But when you look at what TxDOT's proposing in terms of how many lanes they want to add, and then how many new frontage lanes they want to build on top of that, it looks a whole lot like what the Katy Freeway looks like. But I would argue that the Katy Freeway is not comparable. So this is the same kind of map for I-10 for the 15 miles from 610 to Katy. So here's 610 over here. Here's Katy. I-10, unlike 290, is an interstate highway that has not just a whole bunch of development around it, and you can see the development, but it also has interstate commerce through traffic. You know, it's got people going as far as Florida and California on the same roadway, and that has impacts for the travel demand. That's most evident when I look at the truck volumes, that on I-10 out here west of Katy, there are more than 10,000 trucks a day in 2008 on I-10. That's a whole lot of truck traffic. When I look at 290 out by Waller, it's less than 1,000. Okay, the difference in travel demand in these corridors is profound. And so that has implications for how much of this project should we really be doing and where. Now, when you look at the FEIS, they tell you that there are huge volumes of traffic coming. You just haven't seen it yet. It's coming, it's coming. We have to get in front of it and design and plan to get in front of this traffic that's coming. And the reason the model anticipates a whole lot of traffic coming is that the forecast assumes that in addition to expanding 290, here's 610, going out towards the Beltway, this is Highway 6, it assumes that we're going to build this brand new road out here called the Grand Parkway. So here's the controversial segment E through the Katy Prairie, and then this is segment F1 and F2. Question? Or
how much effect does the port expansion have to do with the level of come through truck traffic and rail traffic and freight traffic? Is that taken into account?
That's a good question. The port expansion will absolutely be related to more truck volume. Although actually an awful lot of the truck volume in our region is because we buy and eat and shop and use stuff here. An awful lot of the freight is local. I mean, I talked about interstate stuff. But when you look at 290 versus I-10, it's a whole lot more interstate stuff on 10. That's not really a compelling argument for let's do a whole lot more in 290. And again, so the issue that, one of the issues we have with the forecast is when TxDOT says we've got to build 290, we've got to do it big, and we've got to do it all the way to Waller. Part of their argument for that is an assumption that the county is going to build a shiny new toll road to develop the rural extremes of northwest Harris County.
Which segment is that?
This is segment E. So the naming scheme is alphabetical from around the corner. So this is A, B goes to 288C, D is the part where the frontage roads are built today. This is E, and then F goes from 290 to 249, sorry, F1. F2 is 249 to I-45. G would go around over US 59 and so on. I mean,
So which segment are they talking about, though, that would cause all this traffic? All of the whole thing?
they point to these segments here, E, F1, and F2.
Okay.
One of the flaws, 2 years ago we did a similar kind of analysis for the FEIS for Grand Parkway, and one of the issues is that rather than looking at discrete segments, that they have lumped the forecast together for E, F1, and F2, and G.
Maybe just one way to say this, the reason I-10 is congested inside is because of heat.
That's another,
And
yeah.
the development that's happened because of it.
That's another good point. So one of I don't have slides to show you this from here. When you look at the aerial view now that this segment is built, there's a ton of development here. And the argument gets made, we've got to put the road out there because the development's coming. Except what you see from the satellite imagery is that that's not what happens. The development follows the roadway. Because the similar satellite view for the segment where it's not built looks nothing like where it is built.
But don't you think that development is caused more by economic reasons and also good school districts, not just roads, don't you think?
No, I don't actually think that.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. The underlying infrastructure that in choosing, if we choose to spend $500 million to build this roadway here, that will subsidize a whole lot of development for a handful of developers, and then there will be a whole lot of development there. And I would argue that when people are sitting in congestion here and here, when the majority of the people live 15 miles closer towards to the employment centers, that would be a better place to spend our money. The other point that Jay made that I didn't address is that inducing development out here has implications for these people here. You know, the people who are sitting in traffic on 290 between the Beltway and 610 today, if we lure another 100,000 people to live out beyond Cypress, their commute gets worse. And the roadway that TxDOT has designed to meet this demand is not going to meet that demand. So that whether we build the outside parts has huge impacts for the people closer in.
Well,
Yeah.
and about the schools, of course, there aren't any schools out there.
Yeah.
So first the development will come and then the schools. So,
Well, along 290 now, there's a lot of development.
yeah, right, but I mean, we're at segment E. But it's
Because,
nothing.
I've got some more pictures that'll make it clear. Most of that is inside of Cypress.
Where is Jersey Village on that map?
Right about here.
That's what I thought, right, the Beltway.
Yeah, and Cypress is in Parish.
Can I add one thing that?
One more thing, and then I want to go back to my slides.
Okay.
I'm going to run out of time.
Well, just it's kind of amazing that TxDOT admits in the 290 FEIS about the economic development situation that this kind of project doesn't bring any economic development to the region. It's sort of well documented across the country that these kind of things don't bring any money or anything to a region. They just allocate it around. And so TxDOT is now recognizing that they are just sort of doing urban planning and they're allocating where development will happen. But they're not actually bringing development. They're not actually creating, you know.
You're stealing my punchline from like 6 slides from now.
Wow.
That's okay. It's good. It's
They're
important.
gonna do the tax base.
It's the same. I'm sure I won't do it justice, but I'll try.
Just do it.
Okay. What this project is about, when you get beyond Cypress, it's not about travel demand. You know, this is not about reducing congestion. It is about opening up new land for residential development. That is the whole point of the last 3 or 4 segments of this project. When you get beyond Cypress, it's not because there are people there who need travel relief. It is about new development. I love this quote from John Rickerhoff Jackson. He's a Harvard geographer. He says, "The way a city grows, the direction in which it spreads, is a factor not so much of zoning or real estate activity or land values, but highways." And that is what this is all about.
When was that written? When was that quote written?
Sorry.
let's call it 1990 maybe? I don't know. I'll go home and look it up for you, David. All right. The other thing that's an issue is that if we think about the development, the kind of development that we're creating by building this shiny new roadway is not necessarily very sustainable. This is an aerial view of an actual larval subdivision out of Caladura Road. Here's 290. Here is a shiny new frontage lane that 2 years ago didn't exist. This is one of the things that TxDOT is doing as part of this project, is that they are adding frontage roads to segments of highway that have never had them before. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And here is a shiny new private development. So these are little cul-de-sacs, so you can imagine house, 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 house. So this is new development coming, right? The problem with this particular style of development is that every one of the people who lives in this new subdivision once it's built, whether they are 30 or 10 or 70, able-bodied, not able-bodied, whether they're high income or low income, that every one of these residents is going to have to get in their car, hopefully they have a car, to go to school, to go buy a gallon of milk, to go to work, to go anywhere. The only form of transportation available to people in a subdivision like this, except to go visit, they can have block parties, but if they want to have any food at their block party, they're going to have to get in a car. And I would argue that that's not particularly equitable. In Harris County, there are more than 100,000 households with no car, and across the state, the statistic is that 1 in 5 adult Texans cannot or does not drive. So the kind of development we build has implications for access and mobility for all kinds of people. In contrast, this is downtown Waller. This is the far end of this is as far out as you can get. And here's Old 290, again next to the UP freight rail line, right next to it. Does this look different than what we were just looking at? Say again?
C&D, more of a traditional neighborhood.
It's a traditional neighborhood, exactly. This grid is 100 years old, but it's a street grid. It's got short block faces. The distances from parcel to parcel are walkable. And when you talk to people in the city of Waller, they've been working for 4 years now on what's called a Livable Centers Plan. They've actually partnered with the Houston-Galveston Area Council because they want more of this. They want to figure out, how do we invest in street infrastructure and sidewalks and pedestrian scale lighting and attract development to this grid so that everyone who lives in Waller can drive to it if they need to, or if they don't have a car, they might be able to bike to it, or they might be able to walk to it. That this is a more sustainable, more equitable form of development that the city of Waller is fighting to get right now as we speak. They've been working on that for years.
But this is homeowner or resident driven, the other is developer driven.
That's true. That is true.
It costs a lot of money to do something like that with a developer.
You are correct, sir. It does. But, so the interesting thing is, it has a lot to do with where the money comes from. If most of our new infrastructure, well maybe not most, but an awful lot, let's say half, of our new roadway infrastructure is funded with federal dollars, it matters what you can get federal money for. And the interesting thing is that in the last 18 months, the federal government has gotten very clear that bigger, wider highways that go off to nowhere and encourage people to live in the exurbs are not sustainable. And so there is a Sustainable Communities Partnership between the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and also the Environmental Protection Agency, that from these 3 cabinet level positions on down, there is recognition that federal money needs to stop doing the sprawl thing and figure out how to fund and enable livable centers and grids just like Waller is trying to do. They're going to spend, I want to say $3 billion this year, EPA is, on projects to try to do more stuff like Waller. And actually, this region is going after one of the Sustainable Communities Planning grants to try to figure out how could we do some more of this in the region. But the odds are that it's going to start to get hard to get federal money to do stuff the way we used to do stuff around here. The other thing I want to talk about is frontage roads, and Jay already touched on this. This is US 290 out at Kermier Road. We're 31 miles west of 610. And you will note that there are main lanes and shoulders, but there are no frontage roads. which is actually the way most of this country and most of the rest of the world design highways and interstates. That you don't put frontage roads there. The whole concept of having frontage roads next to our freeways is a guy named Dewitt Greer at TxDOT in the 1960s is like, we've got to do this, let's do frontage roads, and it'll bring all the development over here where we can see it. The problem is, if you put all your commercial development right next to your highways, you create a whole bunch of new traffic conflicts. There are driveways, there are people who are driving this way but looking at street signs and development signs over there. And your freeway speeds come down and down and down, and your congestion goes up and up and up. When you look at Katy Freeway, there is an estimate that more than half of the traffic on the Katy Freeway is actually local traffic, making trips less than 2 to 3 miles to get back and forth along commercial development along the side of the freeway. Now, that's an option. We don't have to do that. Obviously, where we've got it, we've got it. But the opportunity before TxDOT is to say, out here someplace like Kermier Road, where there are no frontage roads, let's not build new ones. And the result of that is that the commercial development that people in Waller need, instead of being out here on the frontage road, where the only people who can get to it are in cars, that it might actually be on Main Street in Waller. That's the opportunity. In fact, people will argue, but we need the frontage roads because that's what brings the commercial development. It's good for the tax base. It's all about the tax base. We need commercial development. That's what the frontage roads are for. Except study after study has shown that these projects don't actually create any new economic development. That what they do is they lure economic development that might have happened over here, and they attract it over here to these frontage roads.
It's the same basic thing that they found about building a sports stadium.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't generate new markets.
Exactly. It doesn't generate any new economic development. It merely relocates it. So the question is, it's all well and good to say, if a private developer wants to build new frontage roads and attract commercial development to their property, that's great. But the question is, we have the option as a region to say our federal tax dollars, our local toll dollars, is this how we want to invest them? Is that the kind of community and region that we want to build? Finally, I want to talk about a couple of environmental considerations. If you look at the aerial shots out in far northwest Harris County, they're wet. They're very green, and they're wet. And that's because there's floodplain out there. You can see it here. They're wetlands. There's water. This is a shiny new section of 290 that's been widened already with new frontage lanes. What we do out here has consequences, though. The floodplains that are out there, the wetlands, this is a Katy Prairie pothole. That's way out there, but it has benefits for us right here. That when torrential rains come to our region, that the land out in northwest Harris County soaks it up like a sponge. That the water can be 4 and 5 and 6 feet deep out in parts of northwest Harris County, and that's good for us because it slows that water coming downstream. And as it races to Galveston Bay, it passes through Houston on the way. And so to the extent that we encourage new development out in far northwest Harris County, this water is going to go somewhere. And what we do about that has implications for everybody in the region who's downstream from northwest Harris County. In addition, the quality of that water affects our drinking water supply. That the Cypress Creek watershed in northwest Harris County actually flows into Lake Houston, and that's where we get our drinking water. So if we add 50 or 100,000 new rooftops out there and parking lots, that the pollutants, the benzene and the other good things that are going to end up in that water, petroleum distillates that run into that water, actually flow into our drinking water supply. So we should care about what we do out there. The other thing that's out there, in addition to just wetlands and open space, is there's a whole bunch of farmland. There's existing agriculture, state-designated prime farmland out along 290. This is again still in the study area, out past Kickapoo Road. Just like saying Kickapoo Road. Anyway, there are farms out there. And maybe right now it's convenient for us to get our tomatoes from Florida and our butter from New Zealand and stuff from all over the world. But it's foreseeable that in the next 10 years, fuel prices are going to get higher again. And that the cost of securing our food from around the planet, as opposed to across the county, is going to have consequences for us. So there are CTC volunteers who care deeply about whether we take this farmland and keep it as farmland for us for the next 100 years, to feed a community, or whether we turn it into residential subdivisions and subsidize that. Because I like to eat. All right, let's see. So this is my wrap-up slide. I'm trying to think. There was something else I wanted to tell you guys. All right, we'll let it go. Maybe it'll come through. Okay, so here's the wrap-up of all the stuff I've talked about. The project that TxDOT and the other partners, so Harris County is a partner, City of Houston is a partner, Union Pacific has weighed in a little bit. That was 5. Sorry?
Metro?
Metro, thank you. I'm like, there were 5. This is the project plan from here 610 all the way west to 290. Now the good news is that there is phasing or ordering to the project that takes into account some of the issues we're talking about. There is recognition that the single most important thing they can do is fix this interchange with 610 because that is the biggest bottleneck that affects the most people. And that is what they are endeavoring to do first. And the only piece of this project that is funded right now is it the inbound? It's the morning inbound, right? Does that sound right? We've got Prop 12 bond money from the legislature, $314 million to do, I think it's the morning inbound lanes for the interchange at 610 and 290, right here. Basically to do that piece. That is the only piece of this project that is currently funded. The proposal is to get the interchange reconstructed and add that capacity, and then have the county do the Hempstead managed lanes going this way next. And then to have the managed lanes go out again while TxDOT comes back and does segments of 290 further in. As I said earlier, whether that really plays out that way has a whole lot to do with how county commissioners vote to allocate the capital budget next month. So in terms of where we're at,
My understanding is that part of this is going to involve having a direct connection from 290 to I-10. Is that so?
for westbound but not for eastbound. Does that sound
But
right?
eventually get both ways.
Eventually, but not yet.
Has anyone drawn a diagram of this?
There are crazy
Yeah.
diagrams you can look at. I had hopes that somebody from the project team might have brought them today, but that's okay. They are available. So I guess, and I'll take that opportunity to plug the My 290
You trying
project.
to keep I-10 off of 16?
Yes. That's
Well, because I mean,
exactly
there's a
what
certain
we're
amount of traffic goes from 290 and only goes along 610 to get to I-10, right?
Right.
The idea is to try and eliminate that.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And to use direct ramps to do that, which cleans up merges and eliminates traffic conflict. So there's good that comes to that, but it's just all, it's money.
Well, when
It's
they
all
built
expensive.
I-10, they were starting to get into a cash flow problem,
Yeah,
which is why they did this toll road deal with the county
yes,
and all, because Culberson wanted it done within a short time frame, and they were running into a cash flow time frame type problem, and they just barely made it. I mean, just by the skin of their teeth. And so there was not money left over. They sort of stole a lot of cash that could have headed for 290. It was not there anymore. It's not there right now. And I don't know what the government is going to give them, but the feds, but they've been a little bit tight.
agreed. And that's a perfect place to wrap this up. The TxDOT's money available funds for added capacity are quite limited. There's sometime in the next 2 or 3 years that the argument is there won't actually be any money to do anything except maintain the existing system.
And build toll roads.
And build toll roads. I'm not sure that toll roads are the solution. Toll roads are useful in certain places, but that's a whole other conversation.
The county.
But what I would say is the fact that we don't have gobs of cash to throw at this project. This is together, this 38 miles includes $4.6 billion of possible improvements, which is roughly half for 290 and roughly half for the managed lanes. But some of that money is for segments, out here, is to add new frontage roads. Oh, I just remembered the other point I was going to make. So I would argue that the fact that we don't have lots and lots of millions of dollars just lying around waiting to solve this problem on 290 gives us an opportunity to really think about which pieces of this are the right pieces, the strategic pieces to do for our region. Some of them are clearly more important than others. And how can we design it to make sure that we're not negatively impacting quality of life in the adjacent neighborhoods? that we have time to do the noise analysis correctly and to mitigate properly for noise, and to design that mitigation directly into the roadway as it's being planned and built, rather than saying afterwards, oh, I think we'll just put a noise wall, it doesn't do much good after the fact. So we've got a window of opportunity precisely because there isn't an abundant source of money to do this project now. And the two opportunities that come forward, the next thing is, does TxDOT get a record of decision, or do they take our advice and go off and do a supplemental FEIS? And then the second question is, what is the county going to do? And can the county get it together to figure out Hempstead now and get that going first, versus waiting until some hypothetical alternate scenario? So
Does TxDOT have a backup plan if Commissioners Court decides next month, I wouldn't really care to do the Hempstead piece?
no, in fact, the first, oh, I meant to send this around. The first argument that we make in our comments in terms of why they need to do a supplemental FEIS is precisely that the FEIS assumes everything goes forward in lockstep as planned, and yet that they don't have power to make that happen. And so we would argue they need to assess that. That's one of our arguments. The one other thing I want to say, and then I'll take questions, is CTC wrote up 30 pages of comments about this FEIS with a whole lot more detail than what I just gave you now. And if any of you are interested in reviewing it, it is available on our website. You can download it for free from ctchouston.org. So with that, I'll take questions. I had one in the back, and then I'll come back.
I was responding just to what you said. I thought from the meeting we had with the project people that there was sort of a wink that we need to get this FEIS through to do the only actual improvement part of this project, which is the 610 interchange. And that basically, if the money never comes for everything else, then who cares? And that basically, the FEIS there has to be an FEIS vehicle to do any of these projects. And that the project consultants thought it was quite reasonable to expect that they might do parts of it and then do just completely new FEISs for different projects and never do the whole project. So that he definitely expressed that that was a possibility.
That is definitely a possibility. Coming from a conservative, how do we make sure that the public gets heard point of view, though, the only lever that we have is this FEIS. That this is the place where they are required to take and consider public comment. In contrast, the Hempstead project, because it's a county project and they're spending local toll money, there is no required public engagement process. They do have to look at some environmental stuff, but they don't have to come out and present it to the public, and they don't have to see what you think about it, and they don't have to consider how it affects neighborhoods. The county's not required to do that. So that this EIS is the public's best opportunity to ensure your voice is heard. Jeff?
A couple of items. One, the first one is the city. You've mentioned it several times. On I-10, the city gave us absolutely no help or cooperation. And where you see the good things that you mentioned that have happened, these are in villages or other cities like Bel Air and all the villages along I-10, which do not exist along 290. So pretty well 290 is, if you all hadn't come along, they probably didn't have any opposition or anybody even looking at it. Their MIPs, MISs rather, were just the same old cram down that they did on I-10. They held them because the government required them, but nothing ever come of them, no changes or anything. So you guys are not probably going to get much help out of the city unless you're able to, maybe Peter Brown or somebody is able to get some things changed, but the city has no money also.
I want to elaborate on something you just said and highlight one of the differences. I talked about there were some cool things that TxDOT did along I-10. You're putting noise walls behind the commercial development, for example. That didn't happen simply because TxDOT thought that was a good idea. There was litigation involved. Part of it had to do with the villages, that there are great disparities in median income between the communities along I-10, between 610 and the Beltway, versus what you find along 290. That there are significant low-income populations along 290 versus significant high-income populations along 10. And there was actually litigation, the settlements of which resulted in some of these cool mitigations being done along 10. And I would argue that the communities, the neighborhoods along 290 by and large lack the resources or the wherewithal to use the legal system effectively to get the sorts of mitigation that TxDOT was forced to
City
give.
doesn't help. That's the city of Houston does not help.
The,
That's true.
The other thing that changes is, again, I think that the Katy process was done before Safety Lou changed the statute of limitations.
For what?
Before the federal bill, the Safety Lou federal authorization bill dramatically shortened your window for recourse. So right now, if Federal Highway gives a record of decision to 290, and let's say you are the Brookwoods Estate neighborhood, which is just north of Brook Hollow, more than 100 residents, which is more than half of that neighborhood, have sent letters to TxDOT saying we need noise mitigation for our neighborhood. In fact, when you look at the comments that TxDOT received, all of which are in the FEIS, everything they got in 2007 about the draft environmental impact statement, the single most prevalent comment was we're concerned about noise and we want mitigation for noise along this project. The folks along I-10 had more time in which to seek a remedy for that. So even though we would argue that what TxDOT is proposing right now does not satisfy federal noise standards, and that there is a basis there for legal action if Brookwoods or Lazy Brook or one of these neighborhoods wanted to pursue that. But the difference between 10 and 290 is that with 290, they will only have 180 days. They'll have 6 months from when that record of decision comes out to take that action, to seek the remedy that they're entitled to under federal protections. So that's different.
The second thing, can you go back to the picture of the walls along I-10, which was very close in front of the presentation? What they wanted were the European barriers like Bel Air got, but the West Houston Association on I-10 would not allow that to happen because you couldn't see the car lots and things. They wanted everybody to be able to gaze around and see all the commercials. But is that or between the sound walls, okay, up on top, along the top where you see the sound wall, you'll notice a break in the sound wall wherever there's a street. And that break will be not just the width of the street, but it'll be effectively almost the width of the lots.
The sight lines for turning geometries, yeah.
It's a very wide break, and a lot of noise comes through that, which defeats a lot of the effectiveness of the walls. But the walls have two negative points. They block water flow and they block airflow. And it's like a swamp in some of those places. The folks, and this is also along the Beltway, where you see on the, well, particularly on the east side of the Beltway, some higher walls. Well, those defeat the airflow. They're like about a 12, 14-foot fence, and with no way to pass through. So they're not as tickled to death with the effectiveness of these things as they thought they were going to be. And Bel Air got the right idea. What Bel Air did, but the TxDOT doesn't want to do it. And it is much cheaper than the walls. Because when you build a 12-foot, 16-foot wall, whatever those are, you've got to build a foundation under that almost sufficient for a building. So it doesn't just, heavy wind comes, you blow it over.
I don't think that TxDOT cares. I think it's the pressure from the commercial interests.
Well, it was
You
that.
don't have your Bel Air, because it's a zone community, you don't have the commercial strip.
Well, Bel Air had a city that
Let me
took it to
jump
task.
in here. So because you brought up two opportunities. One has to do with walls have an issue not just for air but for water. So another issue we identified in the FEIS is that this plan includes building a noise wall, one of the 6 places that they're proposing. That's a whole other thing. Well, so one of those places is at Brick House Gully, which is part of a drainage watershed or drainage easement. And the walls are down where they can impede water flow and have flooding impacts along Brick House Gully. So there's stuff like that that they need to fix before they go forward. The other opportunity has to do with transparent barriers. That even in New Orleans, there are other places around this country where rather than putting big concrete walls on the side of the highway like they've done in Bel Air, they actually use translucent barriers. In fact, Federal Highway has a whole guide of here are some design possibilities for all kinds of different noise mitigation you can do, some of which you can see through, some of which withstand wind, The ones in New Orleans withstood Hurricane Katrina. You know, people talk, oh, we can't have stuff
Well, that's
that'll
the
go.
foundation that costs money.
I would argue that the engineering community in Houston is at least as talented as the engineering community in Louisiana, and that these design limitations aren't real. What we have is a lack of will to do the creative best thing, not a lack of money and not a lack of ability. I didn't touch on the flooding stuff at all, but there are definitely flooding issues.
Since people talked about the comparisons to I-10, when I think of the I-10 project, there are two things that always come to my mind. One was the political issue in which you had a congressman pushing for this to happen. And two was the partnership with Hectra and the managed toll lanes, which was supposed to reduce the cost, but the overall cost went from being an initial estimate of $1 billion to like $2.7 billion all total. So my questions are, one,
there's tremendous political will for the commuter rail piece. The Cypress Chamber of Commerce, the Cyfair Chamber of Commerce has a passenger rail coalition that meets monthly. And every mayor all the way out to Prairie View, actually probably further than that, the College Station mayor participates in that there is a lot of interest in the transit piece along here. And then there's a lot of demand close in to relieve the congestion close in, but it doesn't have the same sort of high-profile political support that we saw for I-10.
Sort of follow up, in terms of the project costs though, this project is being used to try to change policy nationally and in Texas by AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Organizations, is sort of fighting against T for America and fighting against the administration, which is trying to change the way we fund transportation and make it so that transit projects actually get to compete with highway projects in terms of getting money. And AASHTO is fighting against that and saying, no, we need freeway money. And the biggest example in that report is that Houston needs this $5 billion. And then at the state level, we will be pushing, we will have Republican state legislators pushing to raise the gas tax. And 290 will be the reason we have to raise the gas tax. And so I think they may not have underestimated this one. I think they have an interest in this price tag being as big as possible, because they will be pushing for new funding mechanisms because of this project. And it's the biggest project in Texas, I think. Other than the Grand Parkway, sort of. But one other thing about the sort of city of Houston not or playing less of a role in our regional urban planning than TxDOT is that the effect of this project in the Grand Parkway will be to induce lots of development, move lots of people, not to add people to our region, but move them out of the city of Houston. So this project will reduce future property values and land values of the city of Houston, and reduce the future population of the city of Houston. But will cause tremendous traffic and hell for the city of Houston. So that it's really unfortunate the city of Houston is not engaged in these kind of things effectively in terms of representing the people of the city of Houston.
To that point, Citizens Transportation Coalition did a candidate questionnaire among the City of Houston and City Council candidates back in the fall. And one of the questions we asked was, should City of Houston elected officials, should the City of Houston take a position on projects outside of its jurisdiction, outside of its boundaries, like the proposed Grand Parkway, which nonetheless have significant impacts for City of Houston residents? And many of the candidates said, yeah, we need to pay attention to that. In contrast, Stephen Costello, who's one of our new at-large people, said that he disagreed with the premise of the question. And so even within city government, there are people who don't buy that projects like this induce a type of development that has consequences downstream. The other thing I want to mention before I forget again, I've forgotten it twice. When this FEIS looks at the impacts to flooding or to farmland, etc., it really only considers it measures the impacts directly in the right-of-way. So if they need 400 feet here, that's going to induce 50,000 houses there. They're looking at what happens in their 400 feet by and large, and that's a huge limitation in terms of doing analysis. David.
We also heard last night at a super neighborhood meeting in Montrose from Jeff Weathersford, who's on our Public Works group, talking about the Richmond rail expansion. University line, and he talked about how the local community's interests in narrowing the lanes to 10 feet or 11 feet, as richmondrail.org has advocated, that in addition to the community's concerns that they're hearing, they also have to pay attention to the other 2.x million people, residents of the overall region, which was an interesting point, I think, from him, to recognize that the streets of our inside the loop neighborhood relate to the use of all of the people that might come across that street. And one, you could extrapolate that the opposite is also an important corollary, and for that reason, Mr. Employee of the Public Works Department of the City of Houston, we need to be paying attention to what's going out in the hinterland because of all those implications. And I think it is not exactly true to say that there is no interest within the City of Houston establishment for the implications of our overall transportation. It is limited, but I think that's where we need to work.
Well, my comment was for I-10, the City of Houston, from the mayor through the council and everywhere, none of them looked out for the interest of the Houstonians that lived along that corridor.
I'm certainly not arguing with you, sir. I think that's no doubt correct.
That would be all the way out to Derry Ashford, say.
I think we got an opportunity, is my point. We need to influence.
We need to, that's right.
Another question or one more?
Just long-range planning has got to be involved in this. The Rice Institute has said that 1 million people more coming in the next 10 to 20 years in Harris County alone. And so where are they going to live? And they're concentrating in the city. They're going to work in the medical center. Massive growth in the medical center is forecast. Energy a little bit. If we look at the communities in the Northeast that have these huge arboral easements, where on the major highways, you've got 200 feet, 300 feet from the highway to the commercial center, to your shopping, to your neighborhoods on either side. You don't even know there's commercial there, except you have to know where the neighborhood is. You're driving there and all you see is green. You see trees all over. And our organization nationally, the Green Building Council, has proposed, rather than the storm sewers that are under the roads, to have arboral easements in the middle of the freeways, where you have trees, you have swales, absorbing the water rather than pumping it into the Lake Houston and to Trinity Bay.
Yeah.
So,
and so that's another great point. There's a huge detention requirement. If you're going to add $4 billion worth of pavement, that has implications for what you need for stormwater detention. Right now, TxDOT is mostly proposing standard Mark I Mod A holes in the ground, mostly concrete.
Yep.
They don't do anything for water quality. They don't slow the flow downstream, et cetera. So there's an opportunity to design these guys in partnership with Harris County Flood Control, with the Bayou Association, et cetera, to make them be green, where they have remediation benefits beyond just holding the water a little bit.
Well, you're looking at redevelopment within, say, within the city of Houston. That's right now just lots that have been scarfed off. Redevelopment of those rather than pushing it out.
There's a whole conversation we can have about that. There's at least 60,000 acres of undeveloped land inside the city of Houston. So that's a good after the meeting topic. Unless Jay wants to jump in and do it, I want to officially dismiss anybody who's got somewhere to be, but I'm not going anywhere. If you want to stick around and talk more, feel free to stay. But if you've got somewhere to be, feel free to do that too. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.